Hi, I'm excited to share with you just for a few minutes a fast little course on needles and threads because today's world of needle and thread is so different than when our grandmas were sewing or when you and I learned to sew. So we're just going to do a quickie. This is a magnified blow-up version of a sewing machine needle. And you can see it's got the flat side, which we know goes away, points away when we're loading it. But look at this front side close up. This is an enlarged facsimile of a thread to show what happens when a thread is threaded into the needle. The needle point and then a deep groove where they've got the hole and the eye. But along here is a cutout, or Ken calls stamped out place, where the thread slides into it.
It almost looks like a pig trough.
Yes, or like Teresa likens it unto a track, and I like that. But the needles are stamped and made that way on purpose so that when this is in the machine and the needle is going down to catch the bobbin, the thread loosens to have a loop, and it go so that there's a loose place to go down in, and it twists around the bobbin, and then comes back up, and then it does that every time it goes down in. Excuse me. The front loops down, and the thread is looped. And sometimes some of you that are so keen might have noticed that and think you've got something threaded wrong or what's going on. But it does a lot of action to go down in, it does one wrap around the bobbin and then comes back up. So that is what the very neat thing of how this all works is why we have to be aware of it so that we don't set ourselves up for trouble. You don't want to use the wrong needles with the wrong thread. And our techs will tell you that 99% of the problems they see with sewing machines is the choice of needle with the choice of thread. And so when you clear that up, you're a happy sewer. So we want to mention again that you change your needles at least every 30 hours of sewing. If I'm doing synthetic fibers or man-made fabrics, the needle dulls much faster. Nature-made fabrics, not as fast. So it depends on what choice of fiber or fabrics you're sewing on. But 30 hours is the longest you want to go without changing a needle. And that might be hard for some of you savers or scrimpers, but you don't want to skimp on your needles to have your machine not last as long and get damaged. So,
Should you save those old needles or should you throw them away?
That's a good one. Do not save them. There's different little systems that we've watched customers do, and we've developed our own. The latest one I liked, a gal saved her spice shaker that has the little holes in the top. When the seasoned salt was all gone, she washed and cleaned it, and then every time she changes a needle, she puts it down in there so that we don't have loose sewing machine needles in the landfill. And I've even had a tire get popped once in my car from a sewing machine needle. The tire guy said, "Where did this come from?" And it was a sewing machine needle. So we don't want those loose, but you might have your own method of storing them. Even if you poke it in and out a little scrap of fabric and then put it in a jar or something. Okay, so all the sewing, and the more you do, the tip can get dull or a snag or a mar on it. Sometimes just curled up like a little curl, like a hook, but they're not made to last forever. In fact, we have learned from training that about out of every 10 sewing machine needles, you may have one come right out of the package that's a lemon, we call it, and it doesn't sew proper, it doesn't create a nice stitch with your thread. So if you are having a problem and you change out your needle and you still have a problem, don't be afraid to put another needle in and see if that might be the issue. But most generally that'll be fine, and your issue will be the kind of thread you use with your needle. I don't know about you, Teresa, but I grew up thinking I was matching my needles to fabrics. And so with the new training that's around and all the new variety of threads, we have learned that the best match for a good team is to match your needle to the kind of thread you're using. So let's just quickly cover about needles. When you get your machine, you will get a little variety pack of needles. There's usually 6, and they are ballpoint and size 10s and size 12s. It's really hard to tell what the sizes are unless you have a strong magnifying glass, but the ones painted are usually the ballpoints, or they are the ballpoints. And then there's the smaller size needles and the bigger ones. So that's your variety pack, and you may also have gotten a twin needle, which is really fun and has a time and place for it. The twin needles are generally always a size 11 in the American sizing, or you can get them bigger, like I do for the things I do with twin needles. Okay, those come with your machine, but you're going to want to have a selection, and we'll talk about some of these just so you understand the number system. The number system on needles is, for example, this finer needle, the smaller, finer needles, the skinnier ones, the number is a smaller number. And so there's European sizing and American sizing. So this is a 70-10. So when you hear people talk about sizes of needles, you'll know 70-10 is for very fine thread that's real thin. Doesn't mean it's fine that it breaks. It just means that it's not wrapped as many times, and it's doesn't have a core, but it's just a fine thread. I sew with so fine thread, and it's very strong, but this is a 70-10 for very fine thread. Okay, the next size up is a 80-12, so it's a little bit bigger. And this works for lots of general sewing and applique or piecing. Works great, and it's good, but you don't want to use thick threads. You want to still be on the side of regular thread or finer thread or more expensive thread.
So on that package it says 50 weight.
Oh,
and
yes.
so how does that correlate with the thread?
You can, now they are labeling threads, and you can learn about weights of thread and look for the measurement on your spool of thread if it matches the needle size. So this one says 50 weight for 12, and I noticed on the 70-10 it's 60 weight. So the thread numbers are the bigger the weight, the finer the thread.
So it's the opposite of the needles.
It's the opposite of the needles, and don't ask me why. It can be confusing, but the more you pay attention, the more you'll learn it. And I have learned also just to keep your needles in the package they come in. That, they're brand new and they're still labeled, and that will be a safety catch for you. I know some of you like to put them in your little organizers or your tomato pincushion, but keep them in your little boxes, and you can put them in a little box just in their little containers. Sometimes people aren't sure how to even get those out, and I remember this being so frustrated and embarrassed to ask anybody. But they have a slider piece on top, and you just slide it downward, and that whole little top will slide downward, and then the top of it bends so you can pull out your needle and not have to break the whole thing trying to figure it out. Okay, so the next size goes to a 90-14. This is for medium threads, and it's a 40 weight, and this is the most commonly used needle size. Hopefully you've learned about stashes of thread and know how to take care of them, or know that thread has shelf life. We can go into more detail another time, but lots of threads are not created equal. And so if you've inherited some beautiful threads or seen some on a swap meet or a good sale, sometimes they're not the best thread to have to put in your machine. So try to stay with new thread that's fresh, and watch the quality and what the thread is made of. Then I'll just jump up to the bigger one. They even go bigger than a 16. They go up to an 18, but here's a 100 top stitch needle 16, and this is for using heavier threads. So threads that are a core covered cotton polyester thread, or those kind of threads that are thicker for heavy duty fabrics too. But certainly does not mean you would use a hand quilting waxed thread or a buttonhole twist waxed. There are threads in the thread places you purchase that are for hand sewing or handwork. And your sewing machine will not be happy with this kind of thread because it's actually waxed. It's got a coating on it. And so the sensors in your machine and the meters, the take-up levers, all of those were not made to handle this, and it will give you grief.
And so it's
So-
hand quilting.
Hand quilting thread, or sometimes they'll say buttonhole twist or utility. Different companies label it different, but these are not even for sewing machines. So don't think, oh, it's the middle of the night and I need this color. It won't work for you. You'll just be so sad and break a needle or have other problems. Okay, so if you have other kinds of thread, just segregate them and pay attention. And if you are a simple girl and just want to keep life simple, like I do a lot of times because I just do so much sewing, I like to stick with the size 14 needles and sew fine thread, and I can sew almost anything with sew fine thread.
So when in doubt, should you go with a size 90-14 to start with?
Yes, yes. And only if you were doing delicate wedding fabrics or something really heirloomy or precious, you might want to go to a smaller needle.
Yeah.
But you can do this and it works great if you're buttonholing or using your feet, the variety of threads with your feet. It's a troubleshooting bliss for me is to stay with a general size needle, and the eye of it, the hole is a tiny bit bigger.
So a lot of times, like you said in the past, when I was taught to sew, I was taught to change the needles to the fabric, and I would never change the thread, but I would change the needle. And it now makes sense that if you were trying to sew a delicate knit or a lace with a thicker thread that I would use on a top stitch for your jeans, that wouldn't be pretty, and it definitely, that thicker thread wouldn't fit into the needle, a finer needle, if I changed it to a fine needle. But I always worried about, in the past, the hole that it was going to make. When you go up in needle sizes, do they really go up in size of the hole that they're going to make?
Only on specialty needles. We have needles in our shop called hem stitching wing needles, or there's another, let's see.
So really, a fine needle that is the 80-12 is not going to make a smaller hole than this one that's 116?
It would on a real expensive fine batiste or something.
Okay.
But general knits or wovens, you're not. When a needle goes down into the fabric, it goes between the weavings or between the loops, and so it makes the hole, but it comes back up. It doesn't make a hole that's going to damage or fray. So for general sewing, you don't need to be concerned. It's just if you're doing something specialty.
A specialty fabric. All right.
Often.
And then you would definitely want to use a specialty thread to match your
yes.
specialty fabric.
Yes.
Okay.
Needle companies have come up with all kinds of different needles, and they're fun to experiment with. And we have really, I call it flimsy, lightweight knits now. And you might enjoy trying a jersey ballpoint needle with it. But then you've got to make sure you remember to take it back out, because on regular sewing, this will skip stitches on woven fabrics or heavier knits. But if you want to try it on a real lightweight, airy rayon knit, you might enjoy it. But I still can, if I'm using good sharp needles, I can still use my 90-14s on this lightweight to
Jersey knit.
Okay. To do alterations or whatever. But that it's fun to try them. Here's we've just gotten a nonstick needle that are interesting. Oh, it's right here. Nonstick needles, because so many people are making bags or totes or little purses and using little corners of vinyl, clear vinyl for the windows or mesh or different things that are made from plastics. And so these nonstick needles are a little bit like Teflon coated, and they still will make the hole, but they come in and out easier because we want to sew fast. If you were sewing slow, you probably wouldn't need these, but when you're wanting to sew faster, these are good. And then there are Microtex. those are more fine. They are fine, more finer on the point to go in to do detail things. I really like to read. They're for beautiful top stitching or quilt piecing when you want to be just perfect if you were going to competition or some of us are really in the box. We want things perfect. So these microtext,
So on those packages, they really do have a lot of information
there
on them.
is, and I just can't believe how much knowledge. They really want you to be a happy sewer. So if you take the time to read um, this one, these superior needles are all made in Japan and they're very fine, already finely tuned, but they are good. And you will find some tips in your sewing machine manual with your machine. You can also go online to Superior Threads or other needle and
Companies
watch
have
some
information on their
tutorials.
needles.
Yes.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
The only last thing is don't grab any old bobbin of thread to use because the color's right. Make sure you know what kind of thread's on your bobbin and do not wind another color on top of a color just because you're in a hurry and you only want to mend a little place. That messes up the way the thread feeds off the bobbin and you don't want to set yourself up for stitch troubles. But if you're using polyester thread, use polyester in your bobbin. If you use cotton thread, use cotton in your bobbin. There are specialty times we'll teach you another place about using a different bobbin with a different top. But for all-purpose sewing, you want to make sure your bobbin thread is the same kind of thread as your top thread.
Well, that's cool. So are you going to show us how to put a needle in the sewing machine?
Yes, that's our last little tip. And you know, sometimes we get hurrying and hurry too fast on this part. And then the needle doesn't get in properly. Okay, so the little shaft that points out to the right has a black screw on the end, and you never need to undo it all the way. You only just loosen it, one little turn usually, and that's enough to loosen the needle to come out. And it will drop out. So it's smart to have your bobbin cover on. So that needle doesn't drop down, but you just want to loosen and drop that needle down out. And I'm always curious, but I like to run that needle point on my skin, and you can feel when it's burred or damaged or you've got it real dull. And sometimes you can even, if you want to test my knowledge of what we're teaching you, you can even stab it in the fabric and see that,
If
boy,
it's
that is
catching
a
on the
dull
fabric or not.
needle. Yes. So it's not your machine's fault when there's stitch problems, it's your needle. Okay, so if I'm going to put a needle back in, you find the flat side that goes away from you. And you know what? Sometimes don't ever take a bad needle out and to think you'll come back later and put the new needle in. Don't take it out unless you're ready to put the other one right in, because that helps you to keep all this lined up and not in your mind get lost about where on earth that needle's even going to go. I like to aim the needle down into where the stitch width is for your stitches. You have to put it down a little bit and then bring it on up into the shaft. And there is another insurance policy to make sure you have it in. There's a little nail head or a little screw head up in there, and you can see it. And you can see the top of your needle abut that. So when it gets up that high, then you know you're ready to screw that back in and tighten it. Because we're sewing a lot, this screw does need to be tightened tight because it's going up and down with a lot of motion and it'll work itself loose. And sometimes it'll even work itself loose no matter how tight you do it. If you're doing rows and rows of decorative stitching, that happens to me.
So if you ever notice that your needle is wobbly, you should stop.
Stop and tighten it again because
Okay.
that just naturally will happen. Okay, after you think you have your needle in right, always do the hand wheel towards you one more complete turn. That equals one stitch. And if there's nothing hitting or bumping or what, then you know you got it in correctly. If you miss this step, you could go to start and the needle might not be in right and it could damage your rotary hook or your throat plate, break a needle, and even damage your project. It can make a tear and damage it. So this is a big important,
And you just
thing
go
to check
slow
it.
when you're doing your check.
yeah. And how sad if you just hit something and break a needle because we
So
didn't
maybe,
get it in.
like I do have a little bit of dexterity issues, and so I have to hold on tight and hold it up really firmly so that I don't have that slippage when I'm tightening.
Some people, you can buy needle holder, little threaders to hold in your hand, especially if you have a little trimmer or a pair of tweezers to hold it with. But find the system that works for you, and also that needle being in the highest position makes it easier to put it in. If your needle's down low, it's harder. So needle
Okay,
in
that's
the
a good
highest
tip,
position. Then we're ready to put your whatever foot you're going to be using. But changing your needles is a big deal, and yet it can be simple once you understand the reasons why.
And then you'll be a lot happier
Yes, happy
if you have
summer.
new needles to go.
Yes,
All
and
right.
the more often you change, you're saving money in the long run.
All right. Thank you, Tammy.
Yes, it's fun.